Welcome to the Jungle Brothers podcast. I'm your host, Joey, and today, Paulie and I are joined by Sam Alderton Johnson. I first met Sam when he came through to Jungle Brothers looking to get a bit stronger for jiu-jitsu. It didn't take long to find out that Sam has a deep personal backstory, which has shaped the work that he is now doing through his consultancy firm, Impact Policy. Sam grew up on the streets of Glebe and Redfern, both pretty raw inner city suburbs of Sydney. As you'll hear, coming up, he had all of the odds stacked against him. Battling cancer and the forces of the streets, he managed to get himself through university where he earned a master's in criminology. His personal experience with the legal system and growing up as an Aboriginal man shaped his desire to make fundamental changes to our social and legal systems. In today's chat, we talk about trauma, racism, social justice, equality, and more. Pretty big topics, but extremely important, and I hope that listening to this, it can help to broaden your horizons or perspectives about how you view these most important fundamental issues that our society faces. If you find that this episode is of benefit, please do myself and Sam a favor and share the episode with a friend. We would really love this conversation to get out there more because we believe it's something that is not had quite enough. Please enjoy today's chat with Sam Alderton Johnson. Sam Johnson, welcome to the show.
Thanks, bro.
Bro, pleasure. I apologise for we had to change this many times.
Good things come to those who wait, my friend.
You're a busy guy, I'm a busy guy. It was tough to get you in. You started a business this year.
Yeah, that's it.
Impact Policy.
That's the one.
Started a podcast.
That's it.
Which I've been checking out by the same name, Impact Policy.
Yep.
Can you tell us what does Impact Policy do?
So Impact Policy is a consulting firm. So we launched in December last year, coming off the back of lockdown. And we work largely with sort of the government, public sector clients. We do a lot of work around community engagement, community development, research, policy, evaluation work. We work closely with Aboriginal communities. That's our sort of, priority area that we focus on. But community development is a broad space. So we do a lot of stuff as well in the flexible learning area, education, justice, and all that sort of space as well. Yeah.
And when you say that the Aboriginal community is like the main focus,
yeah,
what other communities or what other populations do you also focus on?
So we're doing a lot of stuff in the justice space. So in the justice space, there's a heavy overrepresentation of Aboriginal young people in the justice system, heavy overrepresentation of Pacific Islander young people in the juvenile justice system. So we get brought in from a consultancy perspective in terms of trying to work with government to, at the moment we're doing work around research and evaluation in terms of understanding why they can't engage and keep staff that are from those communities as well.
Okay.
So that's a big barrier that the justice system is experiencing. We are really massive overrepresentation of Pacifica young people and Aboriginal young people, but a really low percentage of staff working in those places as well. And we know that it's really critical from a cultural perspective that we have strong mentors and leaders involved in that work. But systemically, it's been a challenge for the justice system for a number of reasons to engage and retain mob from those communities. So we're doing a piece at the moment sort of looking at that. So we'll be talking with staff that are from those communities that work in those spaces, trying to engage staff that aren't there anymore, trying to understand what that journey was like for them, and different things like that. We're doing some cool stuff in the education space. I'm a big advocate for flexible learning. So flexible learning, like other people might think of that as like alternative education. And so basically education and learning models where the mainstream school system just doesn't work for those young people. So our focus for these programs that we're working on at the moment is for Aboriginal communities from a cultural perspective as well. But it's not specific to Aboriginal communities. The mainstream school system doesn't work for everyone anyway. And so we look at it from that lens of how do we think about education, how do we think about learning and development from a more, community-centered, person-centered perspective, holistic perspective. When we talk about it from a cultural perspective, we talk about centering, culture, social and emotional well-being, community at the centre of a student's journey, as opposed to fitting into learning and education frameworks in the Department of Education and stuff like that. Department of Education does an amazing job, but the reality is, there's a lot of young people across our state and country where that system just doesn't work for them because they might be experiencing a complex range of things like, mental health stuff in their families or in themselves, issues at home, dealing with trauma, intergenerational or, personally experienced, a range of issues that can be going on, learning and development stuff where the school just doesn't have the resources to be able to cater for those needs. And so those challenges start to come out through behavioural issues in the classroom, and then those kids get disengaged, the cycle starts to spiral, So we do some exciting stuff in that space. And impact policy, it's an exciting time because for me, I worked in the community as a social worker for over 10 years before I went into government. And I worked in government for about 5-6 years and got to really work on some, really special projects. And I sort of feel like I've gone full circle now where I can come back to that community experience and really bring that to these organisations and policymakers that are making decisions that directly impact, our young people and our families and our communities, and really bring that lens of the reality of, the lived experience of young people and communities on the ground. So, it's exciting.
I want to get into like the motive and what you're like for starting a business like that and what your experience has been and all those things. But what's like from where I'm sitting, when you like what you just talked about seems like such big projects, like such huge things to tackle. How do you go about launching a business that's going to like address some of these massive issues? Yeah,
look, it's you are right. It's massive, and I would say like another word for that is like it's systemic, right? Like a lot of this sort of stuff is really shifting way things have traditionally been working, or looking at how things have been working and how we can do it better, or not so much better, but how can we look at it from a different perspective and lens, and things like that. So, like the issues are huge. And I think for us, it's about recognising that the most critical thing that we can bring in is a perspective and evidence base that necessarily hasn't really been front and centre for a long time. There's this regional community in New South Wales called Walgett. It's like over 90% Aboriginal community. There's only one high school in that community, and they call it a connected community school in New South Wales. So this school gets like ridiculous amount of funding to service that community, and for years and year on year they just struggle to engage kids in that school, and so but for me I see the biggest barrier there is that there's no other options for young people that can't attend those schools. And so we come in from a perspective of that's like that old Albert Einstein quote, you keep doing the same thing over and over again. It's like the definition of insanity. So we're trying to come in with fresh thinking from a cultural perspective as well, and go like, there's different ways we can look at this, like, and, from a cost benefit analysis too, like, there's value in taking a leap at looking at how community can lead and be involved in making decisions about education for their community and young people that live in there. So it is massive, but we just try and really focus on what we can control and just try and take it step by step. Where can we have the most massive impact? So at the moment, with this sort of stuff, it's about being able to, pull together the right evidence to inform the people that are making those decisions. And to do that, it's about, like, any sort of consultancy firm or business can do research and evidence, but for us, it's about, like, we do that in a way where we're engaging directly with community and that they're key parts of developing that knowledge base. And so for us, if that's the one thing we can focus on right now, then that can have the biggest impact, because for such a long time, so many people in our communities haven't had a voice in development of policy. Any sort of social policy, if you think about education, if you think about the criminal justice system, mental health, alcohol and drug space, that's all people making these policy decisions that are so far removed from the realities of what those communities are experiencing, right? So for us, we really try and honour, we've got key principles about how we do our work and all that sort of stuff. And we really feel like that's That's the critical ingredient for us. But we recognise it's a massive job, and we're playing the long game. You know what I mean? Like, from an Aboriginal perspective, our communities have been, surviving the impacts of 1788 for over 200 years, and we're still living with the realities of the systemic impacts of that today. And so we recognise that this is a long game. If we're still living and, working and studying within these systems and worlds, that it's not going to change overnight. So we need to be part of the solution, but it's going to take time and patience, and hopefully that's where impact policy starts to play a key part.
Could you, for folks maybe who are not familiar with the idea of, say, of what you mean by systemic, and say, we hear the term a lot, systemic racism, and I think most people would have an impression, but maybe for some it's not. The idea is not crystal. From your perspective as an Aboriginal person, could you kind of just, sort of give us a simple version of what that is?
Yeah, 100%. I'll give you an example of it from a criminal justice perspective, right? So when you're talking about systemic racism in the justice system, so Aboriginal people in Australia are the most overrepresented people per capita on the planet in prisons. Aboriginal women are the fastest growing prison population in the world. But it starts from as young as when we come into the world. So when we talk about the justice system, so my degree's in criminology, graduated social science honours in criminology, wrote my thesis on juvenile justice and policing. So all the research and evidence is there that Aboriginal young people come into contact with the criminal justice system many years younger than non-Aboriginal young people. Not because often that they're committing more crime, but often that those communities are over-policed, or that there's a high police presence, and that so those communities become more prone to be coming into contact with the criminal justice system. So, and
coming into contact means you've come into contact with police.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, you might be, you've come into contact. You might have got caught shoplifting. You might have got caught chucking rocks with your friends, and you've broke a window, or whatever sort of petty sort of crime. But Aboriginal young people come into the contact with the criminal justice system at a younger age than non-Aboriginal Australia. And then with that, so then that compounds, when you come into the criminal justice system at a younger age, it then compounds your ability to be diverted away from imprisonment. So when you're coming in earlier, you coming before the magistrate quicker, and you have less options in terms of going into custody. So Aboriginal young people will then go into custody earlier than non-Aboriginal young people because they're coming into contact earlier with the criminal justice system. I used to work in there was a juvenile prison in Lidcombe called Junaparina, and so more often than not, we got young, and this is for all young people, but again from that systemic racism perspective, more often than not, we got young people and Aboriginal young people that are in prison for victims crimes of poverty and social inequality. And I'll never forget one time I was working in the juvenile prison, and this girl got picked up in Tweed for breaching her bail, and she got brought down all the way from Tweed Heads to Sydney, and she got brought down because she breached her bail because she stole a can of deodorant and a Mars bar from 7-Eleven. And that's what she got. And she got brought down. She got sat in the prison for 2 weeks before she got released and went back home.
Oh, God.
Crazy, right?
In a whole nother city.
You think about that from a justice social perspective. It's crazy. But even if you think about it, even if you don't really have a heart, you're just thinking about it from an economic perspective, it doesn't make sense. That's taxpayers' money we're paying to take a kid for stealing a candy bar and, deodorant down. And these aren't random stories. We hear this all the time. But this was just one I saw with my own eyes when I was working there. But yeah, so then, so young people are coming in the justice system. They're often imprisoned for crimes of poverty, not severe crimes, and all that sort of stuff. And then whilst they're in the system, there's little support around, therapeutic intervention if there are things happening in their communities or if there are issues at home or anything like that. So then systemically, we take kids out of their communities, we remove them from anything structured or good that's happening there, then we put them back in community. But what often happens is it becomes like a revolving door because kids are getting picked up for minor crimes, they're not getting in prison for a long time, but they're going to jail a lot. So then these kids fall. So you hear about this cycle of crime. So then the kids are not going to school regularly. They're not seeing counsellors, or if they do need support, because their life becomes segmented, because they're coming in and out of this sort of process. And we'd see that all the time with young people, coming in and out of the justice system. And you look at it now with like deaths in custody in Australia is a massive campaign that's been going for a really long time. And the biggest thing about Aboriginal deaths in custody is like almost all of these cases where Aboriginal people have died in prison, they've been in there for like, I'm not going to say victimless crimes, but like,
for being drunk or something like that.
Yeah, getting picked up for being drunk and disorderly. Like I talk about one of the most tragic cases. I was used to teach criminology at UNSW, and this lady, Miss Do, died in Western Australia, and she was in a domestic violence relationship with her partner, and she called the police to help her. The police come, and she had outstanding warrants for unpaid fines, because they used to still have that in WA where you could imprison people for unpaid fines. So she's called them in a DV situation to get help. They've come, and then they've arrested her, and then taken her, and then there's other stuff happening in custody, and she passed away like a couple of days later. But when we talk about the system, we talk about like there's the structural way of policing, courts, how all that sort of operates. Then there's the whole like how policy is developed and implemented to disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities, particularly Aboriginal communities that are more prone to that. And that's sort of what we sort of see when we think about like systemic racism and systemic challenges and stuff like that. But it's massive, it's complex. Probably not something I could, answer shortly, but it's a deep dive,
It's important though because I've had a lot of conversations with people, particularly in recent years, right, with the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff about racism. And, you come across people who, I can think of a couple of conversations with people not dissimilar to myself in terms of their upbringing and whatnot, who are just, who sort of don't believe it, and they're like, nah, like, racism, because I got a friend who's, families from China and they're doing just fine, that, and you're like, fuck, like, you come up and you almost can't. Some people you just sort of get to a dead end and you're like, I'll leave it. But the systemic thing is, I feel like it's worth trying to kind of paint a picture for it, because I think one of the hard things with the discussion around racism is that if you say something is racist, people will generally take that as you referring to like whoever is part of that system as being a racist person, right? Or if you say something that is a racist statement and you might not be aware of that, and I would say that's a bit of a racist thing to say, chances are you think that Joey's calling you a racist. But in reality, I've just called the thing that you said actually has a racist connotation.
Totally.
So, and tell me if I'm not correct in this, but so as I see it, like with systemic racism, you end up with a system that is just, and systems evolve over time and they get patched and added onto. And of course, there is a strong case for parts of it being deliberately racist, but I'm guessing many times it just ends up being undeliberately racist. And it just works out that way. And it's not because there was one person that was like, hey, we need to victimize this group or we need to abuse this group. But is that correct?
Look, I think you're on the right. I think you're on the right path. I think you're right in terms of it's not coming back to there's a racist judge that's doing this, or there's a racist doctor that won't do the right healthcare, or one person that's making that conscious decision to make a decision that's informed by unconscious bias, or stuff like that. So I think there's a space for that. But I think when we talk about like the systemic racism, often it comes from that perspective of accessibility for people from the community that aren't white, that come from diverse backgrounds, Aboriginal communities, Pacifica communities, diverse communities where English is their second language, and those spaces and places are designed to be accessible, inclusive, equitable for people from those communities. as the first point of call.
You said, that education is a good example of that, where it's a system that's not built and it's not considering their particular cultural needs. So therefore, it's not an equal entry point for them. Yeah,
totally. And
it is by definition kind of exclusive of those individuals.
Yeah, and this is our education structure, and this is how you learn here in Australia, and that's best practice. But if you're from a family or a community or a culture where holistic way of looking at education, or storytelling is a critical component for how we would engage with this subject matter here to get to this knowledge sort of development. Yeah, that stuff's not commonplace to be prioritised or talked about. So then, it's put on the back burner, and it can be disengaging for some young people in some communities. But you look at, I think, from an Aboriginal perspective, we're overrepresented in almost every negative sort of health statistic. When you look at health, life expectancy, education, criminal justice system. Like, it can keep going, social economic status, whatever we're going to talk about. And so you got to look at it from the perspective of, we have stuff like Close the Gap, which is this massive, you probably heard the reference to it, massive premier's sort of Prime Minister's sort of policy sort of program to address these issues, and get that sort of stuff back to, to improve the lived experience for Aboriginal people in Australia. But for me, I fundamentally think that those approaches fail because they measure success based on Aboriginal people and communities fitting into Western, designed metrics of what success looks like, or what engagement and things look like. So
interesting you said about what success is and stuff, and I don't know that much about all of the values of Aboriginal culture, but what I've kind of picked up is that, and that's why it's kind of, it's destined to fail with the education systems, because the value systems aren't the same. So I think all of our education system these days, it's hugely academic and geared towards academia and kind of, getting rich, playing part of the system type of thing. But there's cultures out there that just don't. And I think it's gone that way even more and more these days. You can see where all the funding goes. These days, sports are barely in school and things like this. But, if you don't have the same values, then it's never going to kind of work, Yeah,
definitely. And I think it's to say that, that's not to say that there's not an amazing amount of Pacifica young people and Aboriginal young people that are the most intelligent, capable academic students out there, because there's so many of them, so many of us. But it's a recognition that, as a system, we don't all fit into the same box. And that, when we look at society as a whole, the stats are telling us something, and so when we talk about the system is failing, communities, Aboriginal communities largely, but Pacific communities are overrepresented in a lot of those statistics too, right? So what is it about how Western structures are operating here in Australia that are disengaging or, unconsciously biased or systemically racist without consciously, doing so, that's having an impact on those stats, And so that's where we really try and sort of fit into that space and really try and unpack that and work with, those people in those positions to try and navigate solutions to try and move forward. But I think a big part of that comes with you've got to have people from these communities at the table making these decisions and, driving that policy and driving that research. If we're talking about criminal justice policy and the most overrepresented people in there are Pacific Islanders and Aboriginal people, then it should be us sitting at the table talking about what are the solutions, what do our communities need, what's the biggest gap for why we keep coming into the prison. We know our kids aren't bad, but they keep getting arrested. What's the drama? Okay, fuck, they keep getting arrested at this time on a Friday night. Man, maybe we need to lobby for some funding so we can deliver some community programs on a Friday night. Maybe we need to look at our culture in the islands, and traditionally it was celebrated day in, day out. Whereas today in modern Sydney, it's not. I got Fijian kids, and there's nowhere that my kids can go to learn their culture that isn't in a church. And so for me, it's we're not really a massive church family. So then where does my son now go to learn his Mecca, his dances, his language? when we know that culture is such a big part of our identity and belonging. And you know, if you pull the layers off and you look at it, for me, that's what I see as one of the biggest problems with our men in prison is we've grown up in a world where there hasn't been value or role models in our community where culture is seen as a strength and practiced and lived and proud day in, day out. And I think that's reflected in, you know, what I see in the prison system. It's crazy. Like I was doing a mentoring program in Parklea at the prison out there. And I was out there for NAIDOC week and seeing all the brothers there, you know, dancing, celebrating culture in the prison. Same for, I can't remember what the week was, but all the Islander Pacifica boys were out there. You know, Samoan, Tongan, whatever, we're all doing, you know, celebrating culture for that week. And I was just like thinking in my head, like, you know, why does it have to be in a prison where like we've got all our men together, proud to do this? Like, why isn't this? Why can't I find somewhere in my community that I can take my son to? Why would my son have to end up in a prison before he can find a group of men where he can learn those dances and have a platform to celebrate it? You know, and you know, there are some good things around. Like, you know, there was some programs out in Western Sydney, but like we live here in South Sydney. We've got big diverse community, Aboriginal, Pacifica, everything in between, but there's not much out there. And so for me personally, like it comes back to like culture is such a key part of the strength for our people in self-determination, in healing, and just strength in identity in ourselves, you know. And I think that's the big part of what was taken away, what's been missing for a long time. And I think you see a lot of people that manage to break those cycles that have been entrenched in systemic disadvantage and all that sort of stuff. More often than not, culture has been a critical ingredient.
Why do they get separated so much? Like, and this is a discussion question, I guess.
Yeah.
Because, I totally see what you're saying. There's not places for them to express it, but I guess what is it about that? Because I know, like, I'm coming from the Islander perspective. There's a lot of like a migrant perspective when you come over and then, you know, you're trying to assimilate because you're at this place that has a lot more opportunity. And in many ways, when you were born, it was always like you were going to move to New Zealand and then New Zealand to Australia. Yeah. And you're like bettering. And the further you go up, seemingly up towards more opportunity, the more you leave it behind.
Totally.
Is that kind of part of it? Because you're trying to become that thing?
Yeah, I think, and look, I can't talk from a Pacifica perspective or anything like that, but only like reflecting on what you sort of say, it's like I feel like it's one of those challenges where, like I look at my own family and I sort of think like it's been a similar sort of journey, and so, but I just keep from an Aboriginal perspective and having family that are you know, connected to the Pacifica community. Like, I just see culture as the critical strength for your identity, full stop. Regardless of where you're trying to get to, you know, when you migrate to a new country to try and achieve the best, you know, life for yourself and your family. But for whatever reason, like there's a disconnect here in Australia. Like, and I see it for my kids. And I think, you know, when I look at like stuff like, like, I might get shot saying this, but like, you know, the 1-4 boys and that, you know, like I've got a few friends that have done some video stuff with them and that.
Who are the 1-4 boys?
Never heard of them, but the rap group, you know, the
drill group.
The drill group.
Nah.
You want to do some bars? No, I don't know.
local drill group?
Mount Druitt.
Mountie
like
boys.
West
Okay.
Sydney
Mountie boys.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm hip.
You know, really talking to that whole community out there, you know, and all that sort of stuff, and the culture out there of like survival and you know, the struggle and all that sort of stuff, and the strength that they found is in that collective, right? In that whether you call it a gang or whether you call it whatever it is, like that's their tribe that they've found to survive. You know, Malak's always in the thing, right? Whereas like for me, I'm like, well, the big part of that there is tribal, but a massive part of that is maybe disconnection from like culture and identity and strength. Like,
So there's an energy there, and they've found it somewhere, but it's disconnected from kind of where it originated from.
yeah, 100%, 100%. And I just seen it time and time again, like where culture has just been like the key ingredient for finding, you know, your way back to who you really are, you know, and where you're going. And I think for so many young people, like Pacifica, Aboriginal, wherever, like if you've migrated, if your family has migrated and maybe you've been disconnected from your roots and stuff, there's so much power in finding where you've came from and being able to reconnect and discover your connection to that part of yourself. And as young kids, you know, if we haven't grown up in communities where that's a lived thing day in, day out, you know, our peers become our tribe. You know, that's how we survive, and you know, whatever, and how we get up. But I think when we get older and you know, we have kids and you know, all that sort of stuff, you start to reconnect to like, okay, like actually, like where, you know, how does this all connect? You know, when I'm looking at my kid, like where's he come from now, and how does this inform who he becomes as a man, and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's full on, man. But
I have those thoughts because I'm kind of like at that. My parents migrated, so I had some siblings born there, but the last three of us were born here. But I grew up going back since a young age, and my dad was a strong connection to taking us back since we were young.
yeah,
He's passed now. Mum was more like, she's here. She was all about education. So she's been here for I don't know how many years, since 1977, but she's only gone back to Fiji a handful of times.
Yeah.
So she's kind of left that. She had a rough time there as well, and she's always very been here. But Dad was the big connection there.
yeah,
But anyway, so now I have kids. I'm already kind of more removed from there. And then, you know, generally I'm busy just raising the kids. You're in Sydney, you're just doing it. But it takes an effort to like try and get them connected back. And we're going to Fiji next month, but we all haven't been for 5 years. And anyway, it's just something I think about a lot, and to try to, at any corner, any stage, whether it's, what do they have, Harmony Day at school or Cultural Week, Cultural Day, dress-ups, or even the rugby, it's just like I'm trying my best, but I feel like, oh shit, I'm not doing a great job. But I know in time, like this trip is something that I've been kind of just trying to make happen for so long.
totally.
Like, yeah, I'll make it happen, but it's hard.
It's very hard, you know. But your culture and your identity, it's your superpower. You know, you got to nurture it, and you got to, you know, however that looks, to find that way to, because when you, no matter whatever work you do on yourself, like you'll model for your kids, right? So if you, so like, you know, you guys you run, you know, the jungle here, and there's this whole values around how you do what you do and how you live and how the community that you've created, and that's gonna, those values and how you live and operate by that's going to filter down to your kids, right? And the same thing goes for your culture and your identity. Like, so your pride in that, the work that you do to reclaim it, you reclaim your language if you don't speak your language, like, you know, stories and customs. And even if your kids just grow up knowing that, like, that was actually something my dad really valued, like, and so they'll always value that because they knew that you valued it, you know? That's how I try and think about it anyway.
That's true.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you more about the business because I don't know that whole space, and got some relatives, and my sister used to work in social work, and like when I think of those big projects and those big problems that Joey was saying, like I have no idea how that goes, how that happens, you know. So I'm wondering, like, what, like these are my dumb questions, like how many people are in the business? Did you do it alone? How do you fund it? Is it like where you get government funding, and who's employing you? Yeah. Who's invested enough to go, hey, let's change this thing? You know what I mean? Because it sounds like you guys would be the instigators for it. So do you go out and lobby for them to employ you to make the change? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, a bit of both. Like, so we're only a small startup. There's about 5 of us in the impact policy team. And, you know, a lot of our work comes out from, you know, there's either sort of tenders that will go out for work that needs to happen that's been identified as priorities, and we'll sort of lobby or apply and campaign to try and get it. And then the other part is about really trying to identify who are the decision makers in this space, who's got the power around decision making, and really trying to connect the dots with who they are, trying to get in a room with them, and just being able to demonstrate, I guess, we try not get in there and try and sell ourselves. It's more about getting in there and creating a space where we can hear about what the challenges are. And more often than not, if we get to the place where we get in a room with someone, often it's because that they've seen the content that we've put out, they've seen who we are, they've seen our capability statement, they have a level of curiosity or respect for what we do. So by the time we get in a room with someone like that, it's about really giving them a space to hear from them, and then us just listening, and then going, okay, and then really listening like actively to try and pick out where are the points here where we think that there could be a really significant piece of work that can happen. So like that justice stuff, we got in the room with this person and they're telling us, a big yarn about all the challenges and complexities with that youth justice space. But out of that came this small piece of work. But that small piece of work can potentially have a massive impact for how the future of that work sort of looks. So yeah, that's sort of how it looks in a bit of a nutshell. But yeah, and how we deliver it, from day to day, like can look very different. Like we worked on this project out in regional New South Wales, out in Bowraville. And for anyone, we've talked about justice a lot in this podcast. And if you haven't already, if you haven't heard of the Bowraville murders.
No.
So I'll talk to it a little bit, but for anyone that's listening that wants to understand more about it, there's a short podcast by The Guardian, 6-episode mini-series. It's a really, really good listen. But basically these...
Put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, sounds good. Gary Jubelin was the lead detective on that case, and he was the same detective that was investigating the disappearance of William Tyrrell, that young boy there. But what happened was 3 young Aboriginal kids... were murdered within the space of 3 months from the same street, from what appeared to be like there was like parties that happened in that street over a period of 3 months, and 3 people got murdered within 3 months, 3 Aboriginal young people. We talk about systemic racism. This was the perfect example of systemic racism because when that family went to the police, so the first kid that went missing, I'm not going to say the first kid because I don't want to get it wrong, but when one of the kids, so one of the victims was a 4-year-old girl, Evelyn Greenup. One of the boys was a 16-year-old boy, Clinton Speedy Duro. And the third one was a 16-year-old girl, Colleen Walker. There's still a missing persons thing out for her at the moment because they never found her remains. But the coroners did an inquiry and determined that her case was a murder or a death. And so the families, as soon as the daughter went missing, the families went to the police station. Regional community. First, there was no police officer there in a regional town. So by the time they got the police officer there, they said, our daughter's disappeared, we can't find her. The police officer said, oh, maybe she's just gone walkabout, you'll be right, you'll find her. Just completely brushed the family off. And they were like, can you help us look at her? And they just were like, nah, she's just gone walkabout, she'll be right, she'll turn up. They just left the family. So the family, everyone knows that in a missing persons case, the first 48 hours are critical, right? So it was like over 2 days before police did anything for that family. And then what happened is they actually sent in, instead of sending in like a missing persons crew to investigate, they sent in like the family and community services crew. So like the people that investigate like child misharm and mistreatment. So when you talk about like systemic bias and racism, like fucking that's the prime example of what it looked like, and then there's 3 cases there that happened, and there was only ever one person of interest. There was all this, we talk about systemic racism. The whole investigation of that case from the beginning to the end was just so like racist and inaccessible for Aboriginal people. The investigation and inquiry of the Aboriginal family members as part of that, the way that they were engaged with. There was a whole sort of parliamentary inquiry into the impact of this investigation and how it was just a complete failure and the impact of that on the families. So as a result of that, so this happened like 30 years ago. So, full credit to these families. They've never stopped fighting for their kids. They've never stopped fighting for justice. They had one person of interest ever in the whole 3 cases. He ended up getting charged at one point, getting in prison, and then he got released. Charges got dropped. And then I got to be a part of, through work, we got to be a part of so the families kept lobbying for like 30 years for justice, and they ended up getting support from, different members of parliament and people that could see that something really wrong happened here. And so they went to the Court of Criminal. They went to the Court of Criminal Appeal. They went to Parliament. So you ever heard of the law double jeopardy?
Like the term, don't know the law.
So if you stole that bottle of water and got found not guilty, but Joey had a photo of you stealing it, you couldn't get charged again for stealing that water because you've already been found not guilty.
Right.
So that's basically what it is. So in this case, this family had all this evidence that came up. So in one of the cases, which is like years after Clinton had his life taken, and there's a documentary out about this case as well, like about these cases. But this truck driver come through the town, and he was driving through doing his regional pickup, and he saw a body in the middle of the road. And he saw this car on the side of the road, and this guy picking this body up off dragging it and putting it in the back seat or in the boot. I can't remember. And he's pulled up in the truck next to the guy, and he's like, "Oh, everything all right? You're right." And then the guy was like, "Oh, yeah, my mate's just drunk. He's just had a massive night. I'm just chucking him in the car." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And then he kept driving, and he said, "Oh, he said it felt right, didn't feel that right, but he never thought of it again." And years had gone past, and he was at a hospital, and he saw a flyer about the case, and there was like and he saw the picture of the guy, and he was like, "That's the fucking guy from when I drove the truck." And so he came forward with that evidence, and so that was one of the key pieces of evidence that the families were trying to campaign to court. So even in the past 20 years, he's never changed his story. It's always been the same story. So there's that critical piece. There's other pieces as well. But you talk, and so this family, they campaigned with the support of members of parliament and staff to get the law of double jeopardy changed.
Because that guy that originally did the time, it turns out he is the guy.
That's what that's what they believe. Yeah.
So he should be doing life.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's what. So then he got So they changed. So in Australia, the law for double jeopardy has been changed. So if you can prove that you've got fresh and compelling evidence, then you can bring someone back to retry them for a crime.
Right.
So all this work had gone in, and all this stuff, all this research, all this evidence had been gathered. Gary Jubelin, the lead case on William Tyrrell's disappearance, he was the lead guy. All this work had happened. They took it to the Court of Criminal Appeal, one of the highest courts in Australia. And it just there was one word in the legislation that they said let the case down, and so the case was not successful. So then this guy went back to wherever he lives, living his life, doing whatever, and the families are still fighting, still campaigning for justice all these years later. But you talk about systemic stuff like that's some of the challenges, but
it's horrible.
Yeah. We came in from a perspective of we were working in that space from a community development perspective, so we had a role with the whole of government in terms of being able to try and I think it was Scipione was the Minister for Police or Commissioner for Police. Before he retired, he flew into Bowraville on a helicopter and apologised personally to all the families. It was one of the last things he did before he retired.
Wow.
Which is a big thing, potentially opens up a few doors for civil claims or any of that sort of stuff. But, that's not my space to talk to. But just a real recognition of the systemic failing of that system for those families. But coming off the back of that, we came in from a community development perspective. Government wanted to make sure that nothing like that could ever happen in this town again. So, you know, what resources were needed, did community need to be able to build the resilience and capacity of community to navigate this sort of stuff? So we went in and we worked with community to let them determine what they needed in their community in terms of...
This is in Bowraville?
Yeah, this is in Bowraville. So we worked really closely with the families.
What type of stuff do you come up with in that case?
They're big, you know, there was not a lot happening for young people, not a lot of opportunities and services and organisations or anything like that. So that was a big part of that sort of response plan that was developed, was a real focus on young people and being able to provide services that could address that sort of stuff. But again, as well, a lot of the systemic stuff that impacts all other communities was present in that community. So we talked about education earlier. A big part of them was talking about, like, you know, we want more mental health support in the schools for our young people. We want, you know, counsellors to be available. We want all that sort of stuff to be available.
But on that, like, say in that circumstance, the key failing from what you're saying were the police. That was their response to it, or lack thereof. And so, is there not, like, as a, you know, in terms of like your role wasn't to go in and fix the police, right? So you've got to. So I'm guessing you're going in like, well, what can we affect? Okay, well, let's talk with the community that's been affected, and that's. But how does that feel, knowing that there's a part, like the main issue in that particular case is something that, well, I'm guessing at least at that time you don't have any influence on.
Yeah.
How do you, you know, I guess, how does that sit with you, and how do you, you know?
It's a good question, because the program I was working on, so I wasn't involved in the legal side, I was involved in the community development side. But in terms of timeline, they both ran concurrently. So when I was running the community development piece, the law and justice stuff was happening. And because it's a small town, most of the families involved in that law and justice stuff were involved with the work I was doing. But when you're an Aboriginal person that's connected to community and you're a face for government, you end up doing everything, you know? Like, so the families I'll be talking to are like, oh...
Because you kind of get... Like, you've got a connection there.
Yeah, you've got a connection there. You're able to build relationships, and so you end up finding... So I ended up being involved in that justice space more than I probably traditionally would have, just because that's how I fell into that space, and families needed that support. They needed Aboriginal staff that could help them navigate access to that sort of space better and things like that. But yeah, it was really tricky, and it was one of those things where, like, for me it was really hard because... A big part of my piece was community development, but there was a big healing aspect. So government committed to investing in like healing for the families. So there was, you know, funding there to support like healing programs. We worked on the building of a memorial for the families as well. So we're a big part of like the consultation and development of that. So like there was a lot of like really like infrastructure, structural work that was happening that was really layered with this fucking complex trauma and history and sorry business that had happened there. For me at the time, it was really hard because like my son was the same age as Evelyn, who was murdered, and so, you know, working with like family members that had, you know, been connected there, it was really hard, and you know, I'll probably never forget that piece of work. You know, my whole life, I don't ever think like, and being a part of one of the things we did with the memorial was we again comes back to the justice system, right? Like there's a lot of our people in prison. This memorial was a big part of the family's healing journey. You know, healing is often a lifelong sort of thing. We don't just go through a process and it's finished. But we launched this memorial, and I sort of said to the families, I was like, look, if you want, like I understand that there's a lot of people that can't be here, whether they're in custody, whether they just can't get back to community. So if you want, we can film it, and you can have it, and then, you know, people that have missed the opportunity can be able to see it. You know, you can share it internally in your own family groups or whatever. And I was like, it's not for us to use for whatever, it's completely for you guys. So and they were like, yeah, if you could, that'd be really, really good. And so my mate that I work with now, he came out, flew out, and he filmed it. And I'll never forget it because like it was like he wasn't even there. But then the piece he produced at the end of it, it's only like 90 second, 2 minute piece. But like, fuck, make you cry, man. really captures the significance and the just the emotion of what was happening there that day for those families. But yeah, it was a really, really complex and amazing space to get to work in, and that's the sort of learning and experience that's been able to sort of drive a lot of the work with impact policy. Being able to navigate a whole range of different systems that are working alongside each other, that are interconnected, but sometimes not speaking to each other the way they should, and trying to navigate solutions. But I guess one of the big things that reaffirms is how critical it is to have people leading this work, like with impact policy, that have the ability to be able to engage and connect with communities on the ground. Because that's the most critical piece, is that we need to be able to give communities a voice in, making decisions and driving change. It's not about us, because then we just become another decision maker in the government or wherever. It's about how do we use how we do what we do, our values, our principles of how we do our work. How do we do that to bring these people in and elevate their voice, give them a platform to be able to drive change. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do with. So government will pay us all this money to, do research, evaluation, communications, community engagement, advocacy, all this sort of stuff. And but in the community sector, our communities need, our community organisations, they need that stuff as well. So they need research, evaluation, they need all that suite of services, but they can't afford it. They're running on the smell of an oily rag, just trying to keep their head above water. And so we see this massive capacity. It's not a capability gap, it's a capacity gap. Community organisations don't have the ability to be able to engage in those conversations on an even playing field, because there's an imbalance of power and resources, right? So one thing we're trying to do at Impact Policy, we call it Spark Impact, and we try and reinvest our resources and our time into doing that work for community organisations as well. So if we're doing, for example, I talked about that justice research piece that we're doing, if a community organisation approaches us to do something similar, we'll do that for them as well, if they want to drive that sort of stuff. And we see that as the massive difference. We see a lot of really good community organisations doing amazing work, but no one knows about them. No one hears about them. They don't have flashy, video work or, a nice annual report. And then often, more often than not, you see the ones that do, and they're often the ones that are producing the lower outcomes. You know what I mean? But they've got the flashy sort of stuff in front of you, and that gets them in front of the decision makers and all that, because they look like they're talking the same language. And
marketing and sales, huh?
It's critical. It's critical even on the community ground.
Can you talk on what your upbringing was like? Because we've spoken about some of your previous work. How old are you?
35.
And it sounds like you've done a lot of fucking good work in your time. Well done.
Yeah,
and study and all that stuff. But your childhood, we were talking earlier off air that you grew up in Glebe.
Yep.
I'm guessing that must have been hugely influential in your passion to go into this realm of social work and whatnot. Yeah,
look, massively. Bro, I grew up in Glebe. A probably really challenging sort of upbringing in a lot of ways. I got a mother and father who both were lovely people that had really experienced the worst trauma that most people could experience as children. And so they really dealt with a lot of, although they had coexisting issues of alcohol and drug addiction and mental health, illness. So my mum more so, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So she was, growing up with her, she was really unwell. They used a lot of drugs as well to, often would use the language of self-medicate, this is my medication, for what I've been through in my life. I remember growing up hearing that sort of language and thinking, fuck, sad. But anyway, beautiful people, but just been through a lot of trauma and had a lot of challenges. So childhood was pretty hard. We grew up in a lot of poverty. We used to rely on there's this massive charity at the moment called Oz Harvest. And we used to have that before Oz Harvest even existed. We used to live off this guy used to do pickups from Woolies back in the day when they're about to throw out their food before it goes off. And he'd deliver it to all the households in Glebe that were struggling. And I just have memories of living off these fucking pizza bases. That was
Nothing
it.
on
And I
it.
put butter on it.
Yeah.
And that was it, man.
Yeah.
You know, it was good enough. And probably why I got gluten intolerance now, but but yeah, look, it was really tough, man. And but in a lot of ways, it sort of shaped who I was. But when I got into year 7, I just went off the rails. I got expelled from Balmain High in the first 3 weeks of year 7. I'd never been in trouble in primary school as a kid. I was a great kid, but for whatever reason, I don't know, I got into 3 fights in the space of like 3 weeks. I got asked to leave, you know, which was the equivalent, you know, in your first 3 weeks of year 7. So then I found myself at Glebe High, and Glebe High was great. I loved it. Fell into the basketball team, and did really well. That school went on to have a really successful career in basketball. They won 2 state titles for a state, you know, school in the struggle. Shout out to Glebe, like solid basketball program came out of there. But I started to commit a lot of crime as a kid, and not even knowing. So you talk, like the first time I broke into a house, I was 12 years old, and I didn't even know. Like I knew, but you know, but they talk about in the legal definition of like culpability is like mens rea. Like, you know, did he know that he was going to do that when he did that action? So I remember being 12 and this kid was a year older than me. He's like, oh, let's go in. We're going to break into this house and go in, and there's this junkie that lives in there and he'll be asleep and we'll just take some stuff. And I was like, yeah, all right, whatever. I'll just follow you, you know. So, you know, I fell into like just doing silly stuff like that, just following people as a 12-year-old kid, you know. You know, getting into stolen cars, playing around with that sort of stuff for a little bit. Yeah, so those first couple of years of high school were pretty tricky, pretty slippery slope. You know, I don't want to talk too much about a lot of that sort of stuff, but I guess what really became a blessing in disguise was I actually got cancer. So when I was 14, I got diagnosed with leukemia. And
No way.
yeah, and so amongst, you know, dealing with the really complex disadvantage and struggle that our families was going in, I was still on this basketball team playing in this rep program that was doing really well, but I'd still like disappear for, you know, days on end, and I was still getting suspended and all this sort of stuff, and it was in February before the rep season was about to start, and I kept getting sick all the time. I couldn't work out why I kept getting sick, and I remember I tried to go to I was like, Mum, I've got to go to the doctors. I was like, can you drive me? She's like, nah, I can't drive you. And I was like, struggling to breathe. I was like, no, can you drive me? She's like, no, I'm not driving you. I've been drinking or whatever. I was like, fuck. So I had to walk to the doctors. Would have taken me 10 minutes normally to walk to the doctors from our house in Glebe. Took me about over an hour. I'll never forget that walk in my life. I had to stop about 5 times to like catch my breath. So a 14-year-old kid. Got in there. Doctor was like, she did a test or something, and she was like, nah, something's not right. They just called my mum. My mum came. They took me to the hospital. Next minute, in the hospital, man, sick as a dog for like 12 months. Had leukemia. Luckily, it was caught early. It was a treatable one. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia is really treatable for young people. But it was crazy. My whole world went upside down. In that space of time, I had a stroke. So I had a side effect to the medication that they put this medication in your a lumbar puncture into your spine, and the fluid goes up into your brain. Chemotherapy goes up into your brain. It's supposed to they do that to prevent secondary cancers, you know, coming up in your brain and stuff. And a side effect, I had a stroke, which was crazy because in my head I always thought a stroke was like something to come on really quick. I'm having a stroke, like you see it in the movies.
Like a heart attack, right?
Yeah. Like I'm falling on the ground, I'm having a stroke. But for me, man, it was crazy. Like it was like a 2-day event. Like I got up to make breakfast and I went to pick my toast up out of the toaster and it just fell out of my hand. And I was like, oh, it's weird. My hand got pins and needles. It's a bit funny. I picked up my ball, had a ball in the kitchen, went to bounce the ball. My arm was just dead. I was like, oh, this is bizarre. What's going on with my arm? I went to see my dad. I was like, hey, something's wrong with my arm. I think I need to go to the hospital. I can't really feel it. And he's like, oh, fuck, yeah, all right, we'll take you in. And my dad had like a big anger problem in that. Like I think when I got sick, it triggered a lot of his childhood trauma. So he was pretty unwell those times anyway. But he took me into the hospital, and then but we were there for like hours. You know, it's like a public health system. It was there for hours. in that point in time, my dad's had like a fight with the doctor. He's had a fight with the nurse. Oh, fuck this, I'm leaving, and he left. So I'm sitting there by myself waiting for the doctor. The doctor comes to see me, he's a student doctor, and he's like, he goes, have you been drinking? I'm like, I haven't been drinking, bro. I'm like, fuck on, man. And he's like, I can't see anything that's wrong with you. Must be fine. And I was like, okay. So then at that point in time, the social worker knew about my family and that because of the dramas. So the social worker came and see me, and she was like, I'll give you some a voucher for a taxi to get home. I was like, okay, thanks so much, And so I caught a taxi. I was like, must have been I can't remember if that's strained or something. I was like, must be strained or whatever. So I'm in the taxi and I'm going home, and it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, close to 3, and I'm looking in the rearview mirror of the passenger seat on the front side, and I can see my mouth drooping, like going down like that, and I'm like, literally get to the front of my house, and I get out, and I start to slur my words, and I start to, I can't talk, and I'm like, so I start crying because I'm like, I know now something's not right. So I walk in the door, my dad's in there and they're doing whatever, and I'm like, I can imagine like how crazy he must be, because it's like, as soon as I walk back in the door, I'm like, I can't speak, like something's wrong, and he's like, nah, fuck, like no way, like get away, like there's no way, like you've just come back from the hospital, they wouldn't have seen you here back home if you're not well, and so I've walked out of the house having a stroke. And we lived 2 doors down from the park. School was finishing. My best mate from down the road was coming home from school. And he sees me at the park. And he's like, what's going on? And I'm like crying and I can't talk. And I'm having a stroke. And so he comes with me to my house. And he's like, I'm like, Dad, please, like, you've got to take me to the hospital. He goes, fuck, all right. Like, chucks me in the truck. He had a truck. We drove to the hospital. And drove to the hospital, Randwick Children's Hospital, sitting there. They saw me pretty quickly. Same doctor, student doctor, comes down with someone else. Craziest thing in the world, bro. As soon as he came, the symptoms reversed. Fucking disappeared. I'm telling you, no word of a lie. So he walks in and he's like, so you're back. What's going on? And I'm like telling him the symptoms and everything. And he's like, does his checkup and he's like, you look fine. He's like, maybe you had a panic attack. And in my head, I'm thinking like, I do have a bit going on. Like, maybe I did have a panic attack. So I was like, but all the symptoms have gone away. So I'm like, okay, sweet. Sounds good. I feel good. That's what it was. So we went home.
Your dad would be spewing at this point.
But Dad's like, fuck, this fucking kid, mate. So we went home. I got a Big Mac. I was playing basketball out the front with my best mate. Felt great. Woke up the next day, completely paralysed down the left side of my body. I had to crawl into my dad's room with my right hand, like take me to hospital. They took me there. I was in the brain trauma unit for 4 days. Didn't speak. Didn't speak for 4 days. Didn't eat for 2. Or didn't speak for 2. Didn't eat for 4. Can't remember which one it was. But it was fucking crazy.
Oof.
Crazy. And it was scary because they couldn't tell me. I could see the fear in my parents' eyes. I could see the fear about like, okay, I've never seen them scared, And the doctors with brain stuff, it's really hard to tell. So they couldn't give anyone any answers on what recovery could look like. So I just, thank whoever was looking out that it managed to reverse itself. And, I'm able to be here today and do what I'm doing. But yeah, it was crazy, bro.
Incredible story.
Yeah, and then not long after that, I left home. So things got crazy, and then I moved out of home like 6 months later.
Before 15?
Yeah, I think I just turned 15.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where'd you go?
So the social workers at the hospital, they referred me. They were like, we're gonna, I was at that age where like it's really hard when there's kids that are going through neglect and abuse and stuff like that. It's once you get to like 12, 13, the system's so overwhelmed, man, that they're not interested in those kids. Like they're too old now. So I was in that sort of group. It's like teenager, And but they were like, we're going to refer you to this service called Bernardo's. So they have an out-of-home care, foster care placement. They have a program for adolescent kids. We're going to make a referral there because we think you need some support in that. I was like, yeah, all right, whatever. So I ended up going and living in this group home in King's Cross for a bit. Lived in another foster care placement in Elizabeth Bay, and then I ended up getting my own independent living place in Glebe because I was still at school, but as part of that program when I was a bit older after that. But yeah, it was heavy, bro. But I couldn't stay living at home anymore because it was just that was just so unwell, you know. And but I had a younger sister at the time, and she was 10 years younger, so she ended up like a year after that, you know, my dad was living down the block in Redfern, and you know, Docs at the time came in and removed her, so she was in foster care from the age of 7 to the age of 18, which was pretty rough, but yeah, it was what it was, and it was probably, you know, needed to happen, to be honest. But yeah, it was a lot of life happened, bro, in a couple of years. Like, yeah.
How did you end up at uni? Like, where, you know?
Yeah.
What was the circumstances where you kind of
Yeah.
pulled out and saw something better, and you were like, fuck?
Yeah, so like living in the foster care space and just trying to like survive and work everything out. Like, it's funny, like I was in a real bad space before I got cancer, and when I got out of cancer, I had this real different perspective, right? Because you're actually confronted with your mortality, like, and life and all that sort of stuff. So I was thinking about that at a very young age. And so I definitely had this, you know, reflection and understanding about thinking about what purpose was and all that. But that being said, I still fell back into the same community that I was from. So I still, after a while, fell back into similar sorts of crowds where crime was happening, where drugs was happening, where all that sort of stuff was very normalised. And, you know, fell into a bit of that sort of stuff myself. But the best thing was that I never left school, so I always stayed connected to school. But I just showed up, never did nothing. And what I didn't realise, because I never applied anything in class, was that I actually had a side effect from the stroke. So when I got to like year 12, I tried to have a crack in the exam, and my hand would get so cramped, and I'd like the 2-hour exam, and I'd write one page. And like, I'd be like, oh man, why is my hand? And then I actually had to think like, is this because I had a stroke? And then I went and see the doctor. The doctor's like, yeah, 100% it's because you had a stroke. Like, you should be like getting special provisions and using a laptop or getting a writer to write for you and all that sort of stuff. So luckily, I ended up going through that journey in year 12, and I ended up getting that sort of stuff and getting access to that. But I was living by myself in Glebe, and so through the St. Bernardo's Youth Charity, they had this program, so I had my own place, and but I still never applied myself, and I got to my trials and I failed every exam except for like PDLP. I think I got like 50 out of 100. I remember going back to my house by myself, sitting there and just thinking like, fuck, I've got nothing else. Like, this is it. Like, whatever happens here, like, is going to determine like what the next steps are for where we're going. Like, and it was like, I was like, no one else can fix this but me.
No one's going to do it for you.
No one's going to do it, man. And I've been through a lot of stuff, and I can blame a lot of people. But at the end of the day, like, I've got a space and I've got some time. Like, fuck, I need to have a crack. And so something just happened, man. Like a switch flicked. The next day after I failed all those trials, I went to Sydney Uni Library every day. Every day, I swear to God, every day after school. And then when STUVAC came, the 8-week gap before the final exams, I was at Sydney Uni Library from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m, 12 hours straight. I was like a man possessed. And I retaught myself the whole fucking syllabus. I got all the books. I like worked out, like, because it's all rote learning, right? Same for this mainstream education system. Shout out to the Department of Education, man. Test me on any of that. I don't remember it. It's all rote learning, bro. So like,
Just got to memorize it.
just got to do the reps.
Yeah.
Just got to do the reps. So I was just like, broke up my days into the subjects, just repped it out. I realised that no one had told me that when you go into an English exam, you should actually have the essay ready before you go into the exam.
Yep.
You should have the creative writing piece ready before you go into the exam, because the questions, they might be different, but they're all going to test you on the same outcome. So the same topic outcome. So you can shape your essay or creative writing piece to the question. You don't have to reinvent it every time. No one had taught me that. So I was like,
heard that.
So you're telling me I can do all this before I go in? They're like, yeah, it's best practice, bro. That's
So what happened? Did you pass or?
Bro, I topped our year in legal studies. So I went from failing the trials 6 weeks before that to getting like 92 in the final exams.
Jesus.
We can put a copy in the show notes if anyone's something
For verification.
talking out of it. Got that like over 90 something in the legal studies. I think my lowest mark was like 76. It was crazy, bro. It was mad. And my final ATAR was like 76. So because I'd failed all my assignments, but I'd aced all my exams, my ATAR was somewhere in the middle.
Yep.
And luckily that gave me just enough to be able to get into teaching at UNSW.
No way.
Yeah, so that's
So it happened from there, from year 12.
Yeah, it happened from there, bro. But like I tell people as well though, like with youth homelessness and the struggle, like things just still got harder. So like I got to uni and as soon as I finished high school, they're like, oh, sorry, now you've turned 18. You can't, like, I was 19 actually. So, but they extended it. They were like, once you turn 18, you can't live in this service anymore. But they're like, oh, we're going to try and find a loophole because you're still in year 12. And I'm like, yeah, of course you fucking should. Where am I going to go? Like, that's what you get paid to do. Like, find it, So they were like, oh, we'll try and hold it out because you haven't turned 19 yet. So they pushed it out till I finished my HSC. But then they were like, sorry, Sam, we've got to exit you. Like that. And you're fair enough. There's other young people that need a place. So I was exited, but I had nowhere to go. So I was homeless again.
So they're literally like, hey, there's a date and you got to be gone by then and it's on you.
Yeah. They do their best to create like an exit plan and try and link you up with services. But for me, it sort of fell apart and I had nowhere to go. And so I couch surfed. One of these aunties took me in Glebe. And I just had this because I'd gone through that.
One of your aunties or an auntie?
An auntie in the
which is just like an older.
Yeah, just like a leader, and extended family member in our community. She took us in for the first half of that year after high school, and I was just because I'd gone through such a mission to do what I did in my HSC, I've really felt like if I didn't go to uni, I would fail. Because everyone would be like, oh, Sam, just defer for 12 months. Work out your housing stuff. It's fine. Everyone defers. Take a gap year.
You've done well so far.
Yeah. But I just had this thing like, I felt like if I deferred, I was going to fail. I had to prove that I could go and do it.
Wasn't finished yet.
Wasn't finished. I had to prove that I earned to be there and have a crack. So I did it for my first semester teaching, and I was couch surfing at this house, and I got through. I got 50s or whatever, but so stoked that I passed, my first semester. And then after that, I couldn't stay where I was staying anymore, and I was homeless again. And it was pretty hard. So then I made a decision to defer, took 12 months off, and I was cruising around trying to work out what I was going to do. And then crime was massive in Glebe, and it still is. Youth crime's a big thing in Glebe, but I found myself back in my community, back in what was very normal and safe. And a lot of young people were getting into crime. There was people dealing drugs. All this sort of stuff was happening. And the biggest turning point in my life was one of these older guys had gotten out of prison. He was about 6 years older, and he come up to us, me and my best mate at the time, still my best mate, and he goes, "Oh, got this opportunity for us where we can make some serious money. A place where I'm working, they do they collect money every week, same place, same time. All you guys got to do is just grab the bag, just hit this guy, take the bag, go." I was literally like, "Oh, okay, sweet, sounds all right." Jumped in the car. He's like, we'll go and we'll, do it. He's worked in the film industry, do like a recce. Went out there and seen the place. This is where it's going to happen. It's going to come out of there. It's going to get taken across there. We'll park the stolen car there. This is how it's going to go down. And so I was like, yeah, okay. In my head, I'm just like, you don't know what else. There's nothing else. I couldn't get a job anywhere. Even when I was trying so hard, didn't have a job, didn't have anywhere to live. was just like, part of me was just like, I felt like I proved so much as well that I was just like, you know what, fuck it. Like, well, whatever. And so like 100% I was going to do it. And one of the foster carers I used to live with, he was going just by chance in the week before, he goes, I'm going to Europe for like 3-4 weeks. Do you want to come and house sit my house in the Cross? I was like, yeah, okay. So I was house sitting his house in the Cross, so I had somewhere to stay for a couple of weeks. And that's why I love training, bro. Like, I never stopped training after I came back from having cancer because I became so passionate about health and life. And so even through all this struggle, I still trained. And I went to the PCYC at Glebe. And I used to train there Monday, Wednesday, Friday religiously in the mornings.
Is that the one opposite Tram Sheds now?
Yeah, that's it. That's the one. That's the one. An OG club there. And so the morning of this job, this crime that was going to get committed was coming. And I went to the gym like any day of the week in the morning. And there was a copper that worked there. And he was a great guy. And he knew I was from community. And he'd talk to everyone. And I was just coming out from my workout like 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. He's like, oh, Sam, how you going? And I'm like, oh, just can't find work. I was at uni, but I was not at uni. And he's like, oh, there's a job going here at the club. He's like, I reckon you'd be really good working here at the PCYC. Like, I reckon I could get you an interview with the manager. I was like, oh, yeah, I'd love that. Like, I'd be mad. And he's like, yeah, okay, well, can you come back here this afternoon? And in my head, I'm like, yeah, all right. So I went back to the place in King's Cross where I was house sitting, and I had this sort of, bit of a dilemma where I was like,
Crossroads.
Yeah, man, massive crossroad moment in my life. And I called my friend and I said, bruh, I'm not going to do it today, hey? And he's like, oh, fuck it, don't worry, don't be a pussy, everything will be fine. And I was like, look, man, I've got a bad feeling about it anyway, but luckily I had this. If I didn't have the interview, I reckon I would have gone. But because I had the interview, it's like I had a tangible excuse. Like, I was like, look, nah, I can't do it now because I've got this job interview and this opportunity. So, like, sorry, bro, I'm out.
Chance.
And he's like, oh, fuck, all right, man, whatever. So, goes, and as the story goes, guy that replaced me got caught. My best friend got caught. Guy driving the car got caught. My best friend's life was a mess for years after that, going through the criminal justice system. And then I started a job at the PCYC working in community, and that started my community development journey to where I am now, Yeah, so crazy.
Shit.
Crazy, bro. But yeah, and I had it's crazy, man. I had a lot of guilt that I didn't do it for my friend, because my friend went through it, and we're still best friends now, but like we talked about it after a lot of years. And it was a big thing because you have this, like, when you've grown up with people in the struggle, like, and they're like your family, and this world becomes so normalized. It's like a brotherhood, man. Like, totally is. And it's like, and I felt this massive guilt that like he had to go through that as well. Like, part of me felt like, why couldn't I convince him not to do it as well, or maybe I should have been there with him. It would have gone different.
Yeah, and I'm guessing there's a kind of there's an element of like you dogged him, because you didn't go.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
totally.
Which those feelings of loyalty are so like run so deep.
Definitely, bro. 100%.
Sure, it's motivated you to do what you were doing better and what you're doing now and that sort of thing.
Well, it gives me that insight. Like we talked at the start about the juvenile justice system. And how easy it is for kids to get caught up in the cycle. And man, I could have been any one of those kids if it wasn't for chance in a lot of ways. And you just see so much of our young kids with so much potential, so much character, just get caught up in this cycle because they're growing up in communities and worlds where this stuff's normalised. This is how we've learnt to survive. We've got a lack of role models in our communities, so we look to the only ones that we've got that are out there doing what they should be doing. All these sorts of things, and that's why I'm really passionate about it, because at the end of the day, like, we are all very much the same. But we're very much, impacted by the worlds that we've grown up with, and that's why, the work we're doing at Impact Policy is so critical, because, these are all our people that are in prison, that are dealing with mental health, that are, you know, disconnected from community, whatever it might be. But there's ways that as a community, as a society, that we could do things better, so that as a whole we can all live better and live stronger. You know, I think, you know, I have to think, and that's why we do that stuff with Spark, with the jiu-jitsu stuff with the kids.
So I was going to ask you next.
Yeah. So
tell us about it.
So, like, you know, I mentioned about this basketball program that I sort of was a part of as a kid. And so whilst it wasn't like the thing that saved me, man, like to be able to have an outlet as a kid, to be able to go somewhere and to be able to access a sport and a community that I might not have been able to access, it was such a critical safety for me going through all that struggle. And, yeah, like, bro, my basketball coach saved me from like getting suspended like 3-4 times. It was amazing. But like the reflecting back on it, like we played in rep tournaments, we went to national carnivals and all that sort of stuff. Most of our team was made up of kids living in public housing in Glebe with, you know, single income or no income families on welfare. None of us paid a cent to play. I don't remember paying nothing to go to Ballarat to play a nationals tournament when I was 13. And I reflect back on that, and so now this stuff I'm doing now. So we've this year we've invested thousands of dollars into making jiu-jitsu accessible for young people living in Redfern. It started in Woolloomooloo, pre-COVID, I think it was, and it's been at Redfern this year. And basically, we've invested funding through Impact Policy to make those services available for families and young people, because we know that, like, you know, you look at so much. For me, growing up, watching a lot of young people in my communities, there was so much talent and so much potential, but just no opportunity or access to those spaces and places. So we invested, you know, thousands of dollars this year into doing that, and that's just something we're really passionate about. You know, and jiu-jitsu is a growing sport in Australia, and First Nations jiu-jitsu is growing. Like, there's so much Aboriginal people and young people particularly that are taking up the sport, but martial arts is a bit of a it's not the most accessible sport financially as well, so we want to try and be a part of making it as accessible as we can for young people like me that would have grown up in families that, you know, no way in the world would have been able to learn jiu-jitsu as a kid, and so we're really passionate about that. We got back from a trip out to far west New South Wales. There's an amazing program happening out there at the Mildura Jiu-Jitsu. And it's a shout out to Luke Burnham, who runs the school. His son is Cooper Burnham, who's one of the head coaches down at Alliance at Melbourne. Young guy, he's like 22. Have you heard of him?
Alliance in Melbourne?
Yeah, he's one of the head coaches there, Cooper Burnham. He's like a young kid, 22.
No.
And so he's like killing it down there, and his dad runs the program in Mildura, and they've just launched this First Nations Jiu-Jitsu program out there. So he's also got this other Aboriginal brown belt that just trains at his school. She's a really massive, Jiu-Jitsu advocate, but she's also a massive community advocate. Does a whole range of amazing community work. So I guess she doesn't run it, but she's been involved in supporting him from a cultural perspective in terms of getting it going. But I tell you, bro, like I was up there a couple of months ago, and he's got like an army of like teenage girls training jiu-jitsu like 4 or 5 nights a week.
Wow.
Like smashing it out. And he's got like, we sponsored a scholarship for one of the students out there. So he's got them all on scholarships. So none of them are paying for their fees, for their gears, for whatever. He helps with transport to get them to and from training. All that sort of stuff. He's got one of the girls competed, got silver at nationals. Like they're actually like doing some damage. These kids, like one of their students just came back from Worlds, got double bronze at Worlds. She's a 16-year-old blue belt.
Wow,
Barkagee and Tongan girl, animal monster. Her mummy's the Aboriginal woman that's the brown belt there, Chantel Thompson.
Okay,
yeah, she won. I think she medalled at Worlds as well. And she wrestled in the Commonwealth Games.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so she's a G, man. She's not to be messed with. And she's just as strong off the mats as on the mats. But, shout out to them. They're doing amazing stuff in Mildura. And that's sort of, I came back from that really, I guess, motivated and excited about like, okay, I think there's something brewing here in terms of how we can really try and support and invest into not just First Nations Jiu-Jitsu, but how do we make this sport as accessible as possible for young people? You know, I come from a background where working in the justice system, like, so I grew up. So when I was living in foster care, I started boxing because I got bashed.
I was going to say the boxing model, like that one's been around for a while.
Massively.
There's probably a lot of lessons in there, eh?
Yeah, definitely. But like in the system, like people are really, there's like a stigma around teaching people to fight or martial arts. Because like I'd be in
you're going to weaponize them.
Yeah. Like I'd be in the prison system. I'd be like, they'd be like running this, they call it a boot camp in the mornings, and they take these kids out and they do push-ups and, you know, some calisthenic stuff. And I'd be like, fuck, you want to put some kids through the pads? Like, you know, they all love it. Oh, no way. We can't teach kids how to punch. Like, they'll go out and fight. I'm like, half these kids are here for fighting. Like, let's engage them in something they like. Maybe through that we can do some mentoring. Through that we can do, you know, strengthen those relationships and engagement. And then we can do some deep work. They're fighting regardless. Like, you know, and so
it's kind of like, don't give them sex education and they won't have sex.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly. And so it was often really hard to talk about like trying to do that sort of stuff. And same thing with jiu-jitsu. Like we tried to apply for some funding from local council grant. You know, we were successful, and me and my friend that applied for it, we just feel like it's that stigma around people not sort of getting. There's an education piece at the moment in terms of how valuable martial arts, boxing, all that sort of stuff is from a therapeutic perspective. And there's so much evidence already that exists about the impact of it. But maybe it's a comms and marketing piece, I don't know, but there's something that needs to change in terms of a values piece, in terms of what it can add and bring. You know, I think about like you often hear about like bullying, right? Like bullying has been an age-old problem. You know, it's a bullying epidemic, and there's, you know, anti-bullying programs and all this sort of stuff. And for me, I'm like, man, bullying is the issue, 100%. Like I experienced bullying when I was in primary school. Like I think, you know, a lot of people have experienced that at some stage. But I also think like bullying is like a part of human nature too. Like I don't think you can ever stop. I don't think you can ever stop it. Like there's bullies at work. There's bullies in the gym. There's bullies at school. It's a behaviour, right?
I was just thinking about this week because my older kid and the younger one, the two boys, and like my older kid, he's sweet boy, he's the best, but he bullies him, and he doesn't like bullies. He knows all of that, but he bullies his younger brother, and I changed my mindset around it. And same thing, I'm like, I don't think I could scold him for bullying him. Like obviously there's parameters and you can't step over a certain line, but it's kind of part of how they interact with each other. He stands over him, he's physical, but it is part of
I
part of human
hear
behaviour.
what you say, man. Like I got 3 young kids. My middle daughter Kalani, like she's a bit of a bully, bro. like I see it. The same thing with her younger sister. Like, and she has that style about. Some people would say like, oh, that's a leadership thing, or that's a, you know, it's like a. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. But, so I guess what I'm trying to say though is like, what I'm trying to say is that I feel like there's a real conversation piece when we look at bullying from talking about resilience, as opposed to we really look at it from like the bully and you're the problem and anti-bullies and zero tolerance, bully, as opposed to like, actually, let's look at Joey and like, what can we do with you, Joey? Because that shouldn't be happening to you. That's not okay. And let's give you some skills so you know that that's not okay. But let's also recognise that whether it's this guy or somewhere else, like this could happen again. So how can we give you the skills and the resilience to be able to navigate that if that ever happens to you again? So,
which in turn makes you less of a target for bullying, doesn't it?
100%.
And bullies dissipate as soon as someone shows resistance, type of thing.
Totally.
But yeah, I'm always trying to work with the young kid just as much as I am with the older one.
Definitely.
Because it's interesting.
It's critical, man. And that's where I fall into the jiu-jitsu space, because I'm like, for me, I see that as that is like, you know, you see like Gracie's got their bully-proof system and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, like, I don't think it's perfect, but I see it as like like it's 100% a tool that we should be talking about. We should be promoting. Like, man, why should we not be teaching kids to be able to keep themselves safe if they're getting bullied at school? Why should we be telling that bully, don't hit that person, but he's still going to go, well, fuck, I hate that person, I'm going to hit him next week. But we haven't talked to that kid about, like, well, cover, clash, clinch if he comes at you, bro, because he might knock your teeth out, you know, like. And so that's a lot of things I sort of come into, you know, and then when you look at it from that broader, you know, whether you call it systemic or whatever it might be, like, our young people are more often than not victims of crime, just as much as we are. Even though we're, you know, overrepresented in custody, we're also overrepresented as victims of crime, you know. And we know that, you know, a lot of this sort of stuff with early signs of disengagement and getting caught up in the criminal justice system starts at school. Starts at school with, you know, truanting and disengagement and all that sort of stuff. And bullying is often a big part of that in different, you know, pieces of those puzzles. And so for me, I'm like, you know, in particular, and from a gender perspective too, or from even just a size-based perspective too, it's like, man, what better resilience piece and skill to be able to give a young person to be able to teach them how to keep themselves safe and to empower them to, you know, you can't put your hands on me again, bro, because I'm going to take you down, and by the time I take you down, the fight will get broken up. So don't fuck do it again. Like, I don't know. That's why I'm so passionate about jiu-jitsu, because I can see the impact of it working in the juvenile justice space, growing up in a community where there's lots of crime, lots of violence. Like I said, I got asked to leave in the first 3 weeks for fighting when I was in high school. Been suspended plenty of times for fighting. Seen so many schoolyard fights. Seen them broken up. Seen them really bad. Yeah, and in the prison system and all that sort of stuff. And you just think like what better skill could you be able to do to give someone? So for me as well, that's a big part of the Spark program is being able to make it accessible, particularly for those communities that are more susceptible to being at risk of victimization, being at risk of, you know, disadvantage and all that sort of stuff that puts you in those spaces and places where you can fall into those cycles. Yeah.
And so just on that, does Impact Policy fund Spark Impact?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. And so that's a portion of your profits or revenue that goes towards that?
Yeah, so we reinvest a portion of our profits into funding it. We're trying to look at, you know, more sustainable stuff long term in terms of how can we, not even just more sustainable, but more like how can we look at this as a bigger piece. We don't want it to just be like we've funded a program here, we've funded a program there.
You want it to be like ongoing, self-sustaining kind of.
Yeah, and we feel like it's a bigger conversation. Like we've just talked about some really big social like problems for young people at the moment and different things like that. These aren't issues that are specific to just one community. They're quite specific to a lot of different places. So I think Spark Impact's got the potential to evolve into other things outside of just, you know, funding specific programs, but also looking at, you know, how can we actually drive some changes with how we look at this sort of stuff. So we've got some awesome, we've got an awesome team at the moment. We've got some staff that are doing like a research piece at the moment into martial arts and trauma and wellbeing. So they're doing that right now. So we're just trying to build this evidence base so then we can start to think about like, okay, where are we going with this? We've got a research student with us from Macquarie Uni. He's backing us up with that. So he's going to interview some of those young people out in Mildura, some of those Aboriginal young girls in that program, do a real deep dive in with them around like how long they've been in the program, what's the impact's been like, you know, all that sort of stuff. Really trying to capture the stories, the narratives, the research and evidence, so that we can really start to drive a conversation about like looking at this stuff from a, you know, a real sort of values add perspective for our communities.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's exciting, man. It's exciting.
It's awesome work, dude.
Not bad for a white belt, bro.
Not bad. Bro, I appreciate you coming on and, you know, we could keep going and I'd love to catch up again at some point in the near future and
always
maybe get an update. I'm sure you guys got big plans. Like, it's a fucking big job.
Yeah, definitely. I'll send you through a link to some of the ways people can get involved or find out more information.
Yeah. Do you have, where can you direct them? We'll obviously put all that in the show notes, but where can people check out your podcast? And
Yeah, look if anyone wants to know more about impact policy or the work that I'm doing, I'm really active on LinkedIn. So for anyone that's listening that's active on that platform, you can just find me and connect with me there. You'll find a lot of the sort of stuff we're doing from a community and policy perspective in that sort of space. We're not massive on the other social platforms. We've got accounts and that in that sort of space. But we're also on YouTube if you want to check out the podcast and Spotify. That's out at the moment. It's our first season, so we're on episode 4 at the moment, I think is out. But got some good feedback from there. So
it's a nice show, man. Nicely produced. Like, looks real nice. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, beautiful. I've been told I've got a face for radio, so I've been happy with that. Yeah, mad.
Sammy, thanks, bro.
Nah, too easy, bro.
Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Yeah.
Thanks, boys.
Guys, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please check out the show notes for any of the links to the stuff that Sam spoke about. And if you can think of anywhere where you could connect any of his organizations, Spark Impact or Impact Policy, reach out, get in touch. Please share the episode with someone you know who would enjoy it. Helps to support the show and helps us keep having awesome conversations with people like Sam. Thank you. We'll catch you guys next week.
See you.
Thank you.